There are names that are more than mere names. They are entire epochs inscribed into history with blood and fire. Napoleon. To some, he is the greatest genius the world has ever seen. To others, a monster whose boundless ambition cost Europe millions of lives. But whoever he was, his story is the account of how the sheer will of a single man can alter the world until it is unrecognizable. This is the chronicle of his trajectory. It tells how the son of a minor Corsican noble, despised in military school for his accent and his irascible temper, managed to ascend a throne previously occupied by kings with a 1,000-year lineage. It is an attempt to comprehend who he truly was, the last of the great revolutionaries, carrying the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity upon his bayonets? Or was he the first of the modern dictators, an egoist of titanic scale for whom millions of lives were nothing more than stepping stones toward his own greatness? The narrative will follow his entire path, from the red-hot batteries of Toulon, where the star of his genius shone for the first time, to the feet of the ancient pyramids, where he dreamed of building an Oriental empire. History will show how, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, he snatched the crown from the hands of the Pope to crown himself, declaring to the entire world that he owed his power to no one. It will lead him with his grand army into the endless, snowy plains of Russia and make him hear the thunder of the final cannons on the fateful field of Waterloo. And finally, it is the tale of his last exile on the island of St. Helena, lost in the ocean. The tale of how a man who had lost everything ultimately won the battle for immortality, transforming his life into the greatest myth in history. At the close of the 18th century, the Old World was in its death throes. In France, the cultural and intellectual capital of Europe, the millennial throne of Louis XVI had collapsed. The Great French Revolution, which began with idealistic slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity, quickly descended into a bloody chaos. The air of Paris was thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood. The insatiable blade of the guillotine claimed daily the lives of aristocrats, priests, and very soon, the revolutionaries themselves. Europe, governed by the old monarchies, watched with horror the fire consuming France and prepared for war to extinguish the revolutionary plague. It was an era in which the social elevators, which for centuries had remained motionless, were suddenly set into frenetic motion. Titles and wealth meant nothing anymore. Life, death, and career depended solely on luck, audacity, and above all, talent. The old world had crumbled, creating a vacuum that could only be filled by a man of a completely new breed. And this man was not born in the heart of France, but on its distant, wild, and newly conquered periphery. On August 15, 1769, on the island of Corsica, in the city of Ajaccio, into the family of a minor and impoverished nobleman named Carlo Bonaparte, a child was born. They named him Napoleon. Corsica, a mountainous and austere island with a proud and independent people, had been conquered by France barely a year before his birth, and little Napoleon grew up with a sharp sense of hatred toward the conquerors. He was Corsican, not French. He spoke French with a heavy accent that would be the object of mockery throughout his life. His family, though of noble roots, was poor. His father tried desperately to curry favor with the new French authorities to secure the future of his numerous children, and he succeeded. At the age of 9, Napoleon, a somber, surly, but incredibly gifted child, was sent to study in France on a royal scholarship at the military school of Brienne. For him, it was a world of humiliation. Surrounded by the sons of rich French aristocrats, he, a poor foreigner with a strange name and a ridiculous accent, immediately became the target of mockery. They laughed at his poverty, at his pride, at his Corsican patriotism. And he paid them back with the same coin, with contempt and a glacial detachment. He had barely any friends and spent all his free time alone in the library. But it was here, far from everyone, that his genius was born. He read voraciously, devouring books on history, geography, mathematics, and artillery. His heroes were the great conquerors of the past, Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Julius Caesar. He studied their campaigns, analyzed their battles, trying to unravel the secret of their genius. He did not live in the gray world of a cadet school. He lived in a world of great empires and titanic battles. He was not training to be a simple officer. He was preparing himself for a great destiny. When the revolution broke out, Napoleon, who was only 20 years old, welcomed it with enthusiasm. He saw in it not chaos, but opportunity, the chance for people like him without titles or money to rise solely thanks to their talent. He returned to Corsica, attempting to lead the revolutionary movement there, but the local elites rejected him. Ironically, he, a Corsican patriot, was expelled from his native island as a French traitor. In 1793, the Bonaparte family, poor and persecuted, fled to France. It was at that moment, at the lowest point of his life, that destiny granted him an opportunity. In the south of France, in the principal port of the Mediterranean, Toulon, a monarchist revolt erupted. The rebels, opponents of the revolution, allowed a combined Anglo-Spanish fleet to enter the city. For the young French Republic, it was a catastrophe. The loss of Toulon meant the loss of the entire southern coast. The Revolutionary Army, gathered in haste and poorly armed, besieged the city, but without success. The generals, appointed for political reasons and not for military talent, gave absurd orders for frontal attacks that resulted only in enormous losses. The situation seemed desperate. And then, there appeared on the scene an unknown 24-year-old artillery captain, Napoleon Bonaparte, who happened to be in the area. The artillery commander had been wounded, and Napoleon was appointed in his place. He evaluated the situation instantly with the gaze of a genius. He understood what the old generals did not see. The key to Toulon lay not in the city itself, but in the heights that dominated its harbor. If the promontory of Leguillette could be captured and artillery batteries installed there, they could bombard the English ships anchored in the roadstead. The fleet would be forced to retreat, and the city, deprived of maritime support, would fall on its own. His plan seemed too bold, but in the reigning chaos, they finally gave him freedom of action. And here, his superhuman energy manifested itself. He worked day and night. He gathered cannons from the entire coast, organized the production of munitions, and personally trained the gunners. He was everywhere, inspiring the soldiers with his example. He slept beside the pieces, ate the same bread as the soldiers, and personally participated in the skirmishes. In one of them, he was wounded in the thigh by a bayonet, a scar he would keep for life. Finally, everything was ready. On the night of December 17th, 1793, under a torrential rain, the French troops launched the decisive assault. Napoleon personally led one of the columns. The heights were taken. By morning, the French gunners began to install their pieces. The English admiral, seeing the cannons aiming at his ships, understood he had fallen into a trap. He gave the order to evacuate. The fleet hastily abandoned the harbor, and the next day, the Republican troops entered Toulon. The victory was total. The name of Napoleon Bonaparte resonated throughout France. In a single night, the unknown captain became a national hero. The revolutionary government, astonished by his success, promoted him immediately to brigadier general. At 24, he became one of the youngest generals in the history of France. The eagle had spread its wings. The revolution, which was desperately seeking talent, had found its sharpest and most dangerous sword. But this was only the beginning. Ahead lay Italy, Egypt, and the imperial throne. After Toulon, the name of Napoleon was on the lips of all revolutionary France. However, for the Directory, the new government that succeeded the Bloody Terror, the young general was an uncomfortable and dangerous figure. His talent was undeniable, but his ambition was frightening. In 1795, he would save the government again, massacring a royalist revolt in the streets of Paris with his cannons in cold blood. For this, they nicknamed him General Vendémiaire and showered him with favors. But the fear of him only grew. The Directory desperately sought a way to get rid of this overly popular and independent general, and they found it. They offered him command of the so-called Army of Italy. On paper, it sounded like an honorary appointment. In reality, it was a form of exile. The Army of Italy was the worst in the entire Republic. It was a forgotten, ragged army of ghosts trapped in the mountains on the Italian border. The soldiers had not been paid for months. Their uniforms had turned to rags. Many were barefoot. Discipline had completely collapsed. They were starving, looting the local population and hating their incompetent commanders. They faced the combined armies of the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Piedmont, excellently equipped and superior in number. Sending a 26-year-old general to command that army meant sending him to certain failure. But where others saw disgrace, Napoleon saw opportunity. Upon arriving at headquarters in Nice in March 1796, he delivered a speech to his exhausted and resentful soldiers that would pass into history. He did not promise them weapons or food from the government. He pointed them south, toward the rich and sunny plains of Lombardy. "Soldiers, you are naked, ill-fed. I wish to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." It was not the speech of a politician, but of a warlord. He spoke to them not in the language of orders, but in that of their own desires, and that hungry and demoralized mob believed him. In a few weeks, thanks to his iron will and incredible energy, he whipped the army into shape and then hurled it upon the enemy like an avalanche. Napoleon brought a completely new kind of war to the battlefields of Europe. Before him, generals fought slowly and methodically, moving their armies like chess pieces. Napoleon fought at the speed of lightning. His fundamental principle was speed and the concentration of forces. He did not drag heavy supply trains. His army lived off requisitions in enemy territory. He moved so fast that his adversaries simply did not have time to react. He never attacked the entire enemy army at once. He found a weak point, interposed himself between two enemy corps, and, creating local numerical superiority, defeated them one by one. In 2 weeks, he crushed the army of Piedmont, forcing the king to withdraw from the war. Then he turned against the Austrians. The key moment that transformed him from a simple, talented general into a living legend was the battle for the Bridge of Lodi. The Austrian rearguard had entrenched itself on the far bank of the Adda River, keeping the narrow wooden bridge under fire. A frontal attack seemed like suicide, but Napoleon understood that he did not need a simple victory, but one that would shake the imagination of his soldiers. He personally positioned the artillery, and when the enemy cannons were silenced, he grabbed a flag and launched himself at the head of a column of grenadiers across the bridge. Bullets whistled around him. Soldiers fell. But the sight of their general risking his life alongside them worked the miracle. The bridge was taken. It was after the Battle of Lodi, as he would later confess, that the idea first occurred to him that he was not a common man, that he was destined to perform great deeds. The soldiers, impressed by his bravery, gave him a nickname full of affection and admiration, Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. They saw that he was one of them. The Italian campaign became a series of incredible victories. At the Battle of Austerlitz, he again personally led soldiers in an assault on a bridge, flag in hand. He fell into a swamp and was saved by his aides-de-camp. He conquered all of northern Italy, took Milan, besieged Mantua. 4 times, Austria sent new armies to defeat him, and each time he crushed them. In 1 year, he won 18 major battles. He dictated peace terms to kings and the Pope, sending millions in gold and priceless works of art to Paris. He acted no longer as a general, but as a sovereign ruler, creating sister republics in Italy. The Directory in Paris watched with terror as the monster they had created slipped out of their control. By 1797, he had become the most popular and powerful man in France. Upon returning to Paris as a victor, he became a problem for the government again. His popularity was too great. He had to be sent somewhere else. And then, Napoleon proposed a plan even more bold and adventurous than the Italian campaign: the conquest of Egypt. The objectives were manifold: cut the land route of England, France's main enemy, to its richest colony, India, found a French empire in the Orient, and, of course, follow in the footsteps of his idol, Alexander the Great. The Directory accepted with pleasure, hoping he would get stuck in the desert sands forever. In May 1798, an enormous fleet of over 300 ships with an army of 40,000 men and an entire staff of 167 scientists, engineers, and artists set sail from Toulon. En route, Napoleon captured the island of Malta. He miraculously managed to dodge the British fleet at sea under the command of Admiral Nelson, who was hunting him all over the Mediterranean. Upon landing in Egypt, he faced a new and strange reality: a scorching sun, lack of water, and the fearsome cavalry of the Mamluks who ruled the country. The decisive battle took place on July 21, 1798, at the feet of the Great Pyramids. Before the battle, Napoleon addressed his soldiers with immortal words: "Soldiers, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." The French army, formed into massive infantry squares, bristling with bayonets on all sides, became an impregnable fortress against the Mamluk cavalry charges. The victory was total. Cairo fell. But barely 10 days after this triumph, Admiral Nelson finally found the French fleet anchored in Abu Qir Bay and annihilated it completely. Napoleon's army was trapped. Communication with France was cut. Despite this, Napoleon acted as the ruler of Egypt. He tried to modernize the country, created institutes, organized scientific expeditions. It was thanks to this expedition that the Rosetta Stone was found, which would later allow the deciphering of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. But his army was dwindling due to disease and constant revolts. In 1799, upon receiving news that the Directory in France was completely bankrupt and that enemy armies were threatening the borders again, he understood his hour had come. He made a shocking decision. Leaving his army to its fate, with a small group of collaborators, he secretly boarded a frigate and worked another miracle, slipping through the British blockade. In October 1799, he landed in France. The people, tired of corruption and chaos, did not receive him as a deserter who had abandoned his army, but as the only savior of the nation. The hero of Italy and Egypt had returned. But he no longer returned to serve. He returned to rule. The France to which Napoleon returned from Egypt in October 1799 stood on the precipice of total collapse. The regime of the Directory, corrupt and ineffective, had completely lost the trust of the people. The country was plunged into economic chaos. Banditry on the roads had become a daily reality, and foreign enemies were once again pressing the French armies on all fronts. The nation desperately longed for order, stability, and a firm hand capable of restoring them. And Napoleon, the hero of Italy and Egypt, seemed the only man capable of doing so. He returned at the most opportune moment. In the political circles of Paris, a conspiracy to overthrow the Directory was already brewing. The conspirators, among whom were figures as influential as Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès and Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, were looking for a sword, a popular general who could provide the military support for their coup d'état and then docilely step aside, leaving political power to them. They saw in Napoleon the ideal candidate, without fully understanding that the sword they had chosen possessed a mind of its own, sharp and with an unbreakable will. Napoleon plunged headfirst into the intrigues. He acted as a consummate politician. He met with bankers promising stability, with generals promising glory, with the common people promising peace and order. He played his cards brilliantly. The denouement took place on November 9th, 1799, or the 18th of Brumaire, according to the revolutionary calendar. The conspirators' plan was simple. Under the pretext of a fictitious Jacobin plot, convince both chambers of the Legislative Assembly to move from Paris to the suburban palace of Saint-Cloud, ostensibly for their safety. Napoleon was named commander of the troops protecting the deputies. The next day, he was to present himself before the Assembly and, seizing the moment, force them to transfer power to a new government. The first part of the plan unfolded without problems. But on the second day, everything began to go wrong. The deputies at Saint-Cloud, especially in the lower house, the Council of 500, realized the deception. When Napoleon, unaccustomed to political debates, entered the session hall unarmed, he was met with furious shouts. "Down with the dictator! Outlaw him!" The deputies surrounded him, shoved him, grabbed him by the collar. Napoleon, the great general, was bewildered before the uncontrollable mob. He paled, began to gasp for air, and was practically dragged out of the hall by his grenadiers. It seemed the coup had failed. But in that critical moment, the situation was saved by his younger brother, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the president of the Council of 500. Seeing that the deputies were about to declare Napoleon an outlaw, which meant immediate execution, Napoleon ran out into the street to the soldiers guarding the palace. He leaped onto a horse, drew his sword, and pointing it at his brother's chest, swore a theatrical oath that he would kill him personally if he dared to attempt anything against the liberty of France. Then he addressed the soldiers, claiming that the majority of the council was being terrorized by a group of deputies armed with daggers, bribed by England. It was pure improvisation, but it worked. The soldiers, seeing their general pale and manhandled, believed him. To the sound of drums, the grenadiers, led by General Joachim Murat, marched into the session hall. "Throw all these people out of here," Murat ordered. The panic-stricken deputies fled, jumping out of the windows. The parliament was dissolved. That same night, they gathered the few remaining deputies, and these docilely voted for the transfer of all power to 3 consuls. The first and principal among them, of course, was Napoleon Bonaparte. "The revolution is over," he announced. He had become the ruler of France. He was only 30 years old. He immediately demonstrated that his genius extended far beyond the battlefield. He worked 18 hours a day, delving into every detail of state administration. He reorganized finances, founding the Bank of France and stabilizing the currency. He ended banditry, centralized the administration, built new roads and canals. He declared an amnesty for émigrés, allowing thousands of aristocrats to return to their homeland. He made peace with the Catholic Church, ending years of hostility. In a few years, he brought to France the order and stability it so craved. But his greatest achievement in peacetime was the creation of the Civil Code, which would later pass into history as the Napoleonic Code. It was a monumental compendium of laws that enshrined the principal conquests of the Revolution: the equality of all citizens before the law, the inviolability of private property, freedom of conscience. This code was so logical, clear, and progressive that it became a model for the legislation of dozens of countries around the world, and still today constitutes the basis of the legal system of France. "My true glory," he would later say, "is not to have won 40 battles. What will live forever is my civil code." Having become consul for life, he held a power that no king had ever possessed. But it was not enough for his ambition. He needed a title that corresponded to his real power and that could be transmitted by inheritance. In 1804, after the discovery of another royalist conspiracy, he decided the moment had arrived. France was declared an empire, and Napoleon its emperor. The culmination of this transformation, a carefully orchestrated spectacle, took place on December 2, 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. To give maximum legitimacy to the ceremony, Pope Pius VII himself was brought to Paris. But Napoleon had no intention of receiving power from anyone's hands, not even those of the Vicar of God on earth. At the decisive moment of the coronation, when the Pope lifted the imperial crown to place it upon Napoleon's head, he performed an unheard-of gesture. He took the crown from the pontiff's hands and with a steady hand placed it upon his own head. Then he crowned his wife, Josephine. The meaning of this act was clear to the entire world. He was not the anointed of God like the ancient kings. His power did not come from divine right, nor from inheritance. He himself had conquered that crown with his sword and his genius. The revolution, which had begun with the overthrow of a monarchy, culminated in the creation of a new monarchy, even more absolute. The son of a Corsican lawyer had equaled the oldest dynasties of Europe. But now, to prove his right to that title, he would have to conquer them all. Napoleon's coronation was a direct challenge to all the old monarchies of Europe. To them, he was not a legitimate monarch, but the Corsican monster, a usurper, a spawn of revolutionary chaos who threatened the very existence of their world. Great Britain, the eternal enemy of France, sparing no gold, forged against him a new alliance, the Third Coalition, joined by the empires of Austria and Russia. Immense armies marched toward the borders of France to overthrow the upstart on the throne. They did not yet know they were marching toward their greatest humiliation. Napoleon, now emperor, acted with his habitual lightning speed. He gathered his Grande Armée, the finest military machine since the Roman legions, and hurled it across Europe to the east. However, his first move in this grandiose chess game was a defeat. On October 21, 1805, at Cape Trafalgar, the British fleet, under the command of Admiral Nelson, completely annihilated the combined Franco-Spanish squadron. This catastrophe deprived Napoleon forever of the possibility of invading England. Great Britain became an unreachable island, and the sea its impregnable fortress. But on land, Napoleon was the god of war. While his fleet sank off the coast of Spain, he was already achieving one brilliant victory after another in Central Europe. He surrounded and forced the capitulation of an entire Austrian army at Ulm, practically without fighting, demonstrating an art of maneuver never before seen. Then he entered Vienna, the capital of the powerful Austrian Empire. But the main battle, the one that would decide the fate of the war, was yet to come. On December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon faced the combined armies of the Austrian Emperor Francis II and the Russian Tsar Alexander I near the small village of Austerlitz. This battle, which passed into history as the Battle of the Three Emperors, became his greatest masterpiece, a tactical diamond of the purest water. Napoleon had some 73,000 soldiers against nearly 90,000 of the Allies. He deliberately created in the enemy the impression that his army was weak and ready to retreat. He occupied unfavorable positions and weakened his right flank, provoking the Allies with his every attitude to attack precisely there, to cut off his line of retreat. Emperors Alexander and Francis, confident in their superiority, took the bait. Early in the morning, amidst a thick fog, enormous masses of Russian and Austrian troops descended from the Pratzen Heights, which dominated the battlefield, to crush the weak French right flank. Napoleon waited calmly. He waited for the center of the Allied army, the Pratzen Heights, to be completely emptied. And when this occurred, the fog dissipated, and over the battlefield rose a brilliant winter sun, the famous Sun of Austerlitz. "One sharp blow, and the war is over," Napoleon said. At his signal, Marshal Soult's corps, hidden in a depression, launched itself in a column of iron to storm the vacated heights. The blow was so sudden and powerful that the center of the Allied army was broken and split in two. Then Napoleon unleashed his reserves upon the flanks. The Allied army, deprived of unified command, was annihilated. Thousands of Russian soldiers retreating across frozen ponds drowned when the French artillery broke the ice with their cannonballs. The victory was absolute. The Third Coalition ceased to exist. Austria sued for peace, and a humiliated Alexander I took the remnants of his army back to Russia. Austerlitz turned Napoleon into the absolute master of Europe. The following year, in 1806, he liquidated the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire, creating in its place the Confederation of the Rhine, controlled by France. Prussia, which dared to challenge him, was annihilated in 3 weeks at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt. The great army of Frederick the Great ceased to exist, and Napoleon entered Berlin in triumph. In 1807, after a bloody winter campaign in Poland and a decisive victory over the Russians at Friedland, Russia too was brought to its knees. The meeting of the two emperors, Napoleon and Alexander I, took place at Tilsit, on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. It became the symbol of the New World Order. The two most powerful men on earth divided Europe between them. Alexander recognized all of Napoleon's conquests and joined his fight against England. Napoleon, in turn, promised not to touch Russia. Napoleon's empire had reached its apogee. Its borders extended from Spain to Poland. In Paris, the new capital of the world, grandiose triumphal arches were erected. His brothers and marshals sat on the thrones of conquered kingdoms in Naples, Holland, Westphalia, Spain. He divorced his childless wife, Josephine, and married the daughter of the Emperor of Austria, Marie-Louise, marrying into the oldest dynasty in Europe and obtaining the long-desired heir. It seemed his power had no limits. But it was precisely at this summit of power that the seeds of his future fall were sown. Unable to crush England at sea, he decided to suffocate her economically. He imposed the so-called continental system, forbidding all of Europe to trade with the mistress of the seas. This economic war hurt not only England, but all European countries, provoking dull discontent and rampant smuggling. The system required constant control and military measures against violators, which would eventually lead him to Russia. And a second wound, even deeper, opened at the other end of Europe, in Spain. In 1808, Napoleon treacherously dethroned the Spanish kings and placed his brother Joseph on the throne. He thought it would be a casual stroll, but he encountered something his genius never understood: the fury of an entire people. In Spain, the first guerrilla war in history began. It was a war without rules, without front lines, cruel and ruthless. French soldiers were masters of the cities, but outside the walls, they were hunted by peasants, priests, and women. This Spanish ulcer, as he himself called it, devoured his best troops for 6 years, distracting hundreds of thousands of soldiers he would so desperately need in the future. The emperor, the lord of kings and armies, proved powerless before the united will of a people. He was at the top of the world, but his colossal empire was already undermined by 2 mortal diseases: the hatred of all Europe for the continental blockade and the bleeding, unhealed wound of Spain. Ahead lay the year 1812. By 1812, Napoleon was the lord of the continent. From Madrid to Warsaw, all kings and princes were his vassals or his allies. All except 2, the indomitable England across the sea and the vast, enigmatic Russian Empire to the east. The fragile alliance forged at Tilsit with Tsar Alexander I was fracturing. The main cause of discord was the continental system. For Russia, whose economy depended on trade with England, this prohibition was ruinous. Alexander, pressured by his nobility, began to resume trade in secret. For Napoleon, this was not a simple violation of a treaty. It was a personal challenge, an act of disobedience that undermined his entire system and questioned his authority as the master of Europe. He could not tolerate it. He decided that Russia must be punished, brought to its knees once and for all. Thus was born the idea of the most grandiose and reckless military enterprise in history, the Moscow Campaign. Napoleon gathered an army such as the world had never seen before. It was not a French army, it was the army of a subjugated Europe, the Grande Armée of 20 nations. More than 600,000 soldiers, French, Poles, Austrians, Prussians, Italians, Dutch, Spaniards. A gigantic, multilingual torrent of men, horses, and cannons, stretching for kilometers. Everyone was convinced of a quick and decisive victory. Napoleon planned to cross the border, force the Russians into 1 or 2 pitched battles, destroy their army, enter Moscow, and dictate peace terms to Alexander. He thought the war would last a few weeks. It was his fatal error. On June 24, 1812, under the summer sun, the Grande Armée began to cross the Niemen River, the frontier of the Russian Empire. It was a majestic and fearsome spectacle, but it began with a bad omen. The emperor's horse stumbled and he fell. "It is a bad sign. A Roman would have turned back," whispered someone in his entourage. The Russians, under the command of General Barclay de Tolly, understood perfectly that they could not face this avalanche in open battle. They chose the only correct, yet incredibly painful tactic, the tactic of Scythian warfare. They began to retreat into the interior of their vast country, avoiding pitched battle, destroying food depots and burning villages in their wake. For Napoleon, this became a true nightmare. His genius lay in speed and decisive battles, and here he had no one to fight. He was leading his enormous army through a scorched and desolate land. The soldiers, accustomed to living off requisitions, began to starve. The heat, the dust, and the foul water caused diseases. Discipline began to decay. The Grande Armée was melting away before his eyes, without encountering serious resistance. The Russian army was like a ghost that constantly retreated, drawing him further and further into a deadly trap. In August, after fierce combat, he took Smolensk, but found only smoking ruins. The victory, again, was hollow. Russian society and the army murmured, demanding a battle. Finally, under pressure from public opinion, the elderly, cunning, and experienced Prince Mikhail Kutuzov was appointed commander-in-chief. He understood the correctness of Barclay's tactic, but he knew that Moscow, the heart of Russia, could not be surrendered without a fight. He chose a position near the village of Borodino, 120 kilometers from the ancient capital. On September 7, 1812, the bloodiest single-day battle of the 19th century took place there. It was not an elegant tactical game like Austerlitz. It was a brutal, frontal slaughter. Napoleon, suffering from a severe cold, appeared unusually passive and indecisive. The Russian soldiers, defending their native soil, fought with fanatical tenacity. The French attacked again and again, covering the Russian fortifications, the Bagration and the Raevsky battery, with the corpses of their soldiers.
By the end of the day, the field was sown with nearly 100,000 dead and wounded from both sides. The French had captured all the key positions, but the Russian army, having suffered horrific losses, was not annihilated. It retreated in good order. "Of all my battles," Napoleon would later say, "the most terrible is the one I fought before Moscow. The French showed themselves worthy of victory, and the Russians earned the right to be invincible." Kutuzov made a harrowing decision. At the Council of War at Filly, he ordered the abandonment of Moscow without a fight to preserve the army. On September 14th, Napoleon stood on Poklonnaya Hill, waiting for a delegation of boyars to bring him the keys to the city, as had happened in Vienna, Berlin, and Milan. But no one came. He entered an empty city, abandoned by its inhabitants. And the next night, the unimaginable occurred. Moscow began to burn. On the orders of Governor Rostopchin, the weapons depots and food stores were set on fire. The flames, fanned by the wind, engulfed the wooden city. Napoleon, watching the sea of fire from the Kremlin, was shocked. It was a violation of all the rules of war. He understood that he was facing a people willing to destroy their own country rather than submit. The fire of Moscow destroyed almost all reserves of food and winter clothing. The Grande Armée, quartered in the deserted city, began to decompose, turning into a mob of looters. Napoleon spent more than a month in Moscow, waiting in vain for Alexander I to sue for peace. But not a word came from St. Petersburg. He had fallen into his own trap. On October 19th, understanding the hopelessness of his situation, he gave the order to retreat, but it was already too late. That same day, the first snow fell. It was the whisper of a new and merciless enemy, against which the genius of Napoleon was powerless. It was the beginning of the end. The Grande Armée, laden with enormous convoys of loot, set out on the return journey along the devastated Smolensk road to meet the Russian winter. The retreat from Moscow became one of the most harrowing episodes in military history. The Grande Armée was transformed into an uncontrollable, frozen mob. The principal enemy was not so much the Russian soldier as Russian nature itself. General Winter and General Famine, as they were called, proved to be invincible. The temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Soldiers, dressed in summer uniforms, died frozen in mid-March, turning into statues of ice. Horses fell by the thousands, depriving the army of its cavalry and the traction for its artillery. The cannons had to be abandoned. The only food was the meat of fallen horses, roasted over fires made from the debris of broken wagons. To the hunger and cold were added the constant, exhausting attacks of Russian partisans and flying detachments of Cossacks, who appeared like ghosts from the blizzard, struck and vanished. The culmination of this agony was the crossing of the Berezina River in late November. The Russian armies had trapped the remnants of the Grande Armée in a pincer, preparing for final annihilation. The situation seemed absolutely hopeless. But it was here, at the edge of the abyss, that Napoleon's genius and the heroism of his last loyal soldiers shone for the final time. Dutch sappers, standing waist-deep in freezing water and under enemy fire, managed to build 2 bridges. The Imperial Guard, the last pillar of the throne, desperately repelled the Russian attacks, covering the crossing. It was a miracle of engineering and courage, but it could not save everyone. Thousands of stragglers, wounded and civilians were massacred or taken prisoner on the riverbank. The Berezina became synonymous with catastrophe. Of the more than 600,000 soldiers who entered Russia, no more than 30,000 crossed back over the Niemen. The Grande Armée had ceased to exist.
In early December, Napoleon, understanding that the army was lost and that his empire in Paris might crumble, did what he had already done in Egypt. He abandoned the remnants of his troops and, in a sleigh, under a false name, dashed toward Paris to raise a new army and save his throne. The news of the disaster in Russia, which he tried to hide, spread across Europe like wildfire. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was destroyed. The subjugated peoples saw that the Titan was mortal. It was the signal for a general uprising. Prussia was the first to betray him, signing an alliance with the Russian Tsar. Then Sweden joined them, and after brief hesitation, Austria, Napoleon's own father-in-law, followed suit. A new alliance, the Sixth Coalition, was formed, the most powerful of all. All of Europe, from Russia to Spain, united to finish off the wounded lion. Napoleon, demonstrating his superhuman energy once again, managed to create a new army in France in a few months. But these were no longer the hardened veterans left in the snows of Russia. They were inexperienced youths and old men. Nevertheless, in the spring of 1813, he achieved several victories again, reminding the world of his genius. But the forces were too unequal. The decisive battle, which passed into history as the Battle of the Nations, took place in October 1813 near Leipzig. It was a grandiose 4-day carnage involving more than 500,000 men. Napoleon's army fought against the united forces of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. In the heat of the battle, his Saxon allies switched to the enemy side, opening fire on the French. It was the final straw. Napoleon suffered a crushing defeat and was forced to retreat beyond the Rhine. His empire in Germany had collapsed. In early 1814, the war reached the territory of France itself. Enormous Allied armies invaded the country from the east and south, marching on Paris. In this final, desperate campaign, Napoleon proved himself a tactical genius once more. At the head of his small army of recruits, he moved like a lion between the enemy corps, inflicting defeat after defeat upon them. But it was agony. He won battles, but he was losing the war. While he crushed one army, 2 new ones appeared in its place. On March 31st, 1814, Allied troops led by Emperor Alexander I entered Paris. Napoleon, who was with his army at Fontainebleau, wanted to march on the capital to retake it. But he was betrayed by those who owed him everything, his own marshals. Tired of endless war, they refused to obey, demanding the emperor abdicate. It was the end. Abandoned by everyone, Napoleon signed the Act of Abdication. In those days, crushed by the collapse of everything he had achieved, he attempted suicide, taking the poison he had carried with him since the retreat from Moscow. But the poison, over 2 years, had lost its potency. It caused him atrocious suffering, but not death. Fate did not allow him to leave so easily. The victors kept his title of emperor, but his empire, from then on, would be the tiny island of Elba in the Mediterranean. In late April, after bidding farewell to his old guard in the famous scene in the courtyard of the Palace of Fontainebleau, he departed for exile. Europe breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed the era of Napoleon had ended forever,
but they underestimated him. While the leaders of the coalition divided Europe at the Congress of Vienna, arguing and intriguing, Napoleon on Elba followed the news. He saw that discontent was growing in France against the Bourbons, who had returned to power. He knew the soldiers still idolized him, and he decided on the boldest adventure of his life. On February 26, 1815, less than a year after his exile, with a detachment of 1,000 guardsmen, he secretly boarded a ship and sailed from Elba. On March 1st, he landed on the southern coast of France. His march on Paris, which passed into history as the Flight of the Eagle, was a miracle. The troops the king sent to arrest him defected to his side. The most famous episode occurred near Grenoble. The 5th Line Regiment blocked his path. Napoleon, unarmed, walked alone toward the soldiers. He opened his greatcoat and said, "Soldiers of the 5th, do you recognize me? If there is a soldier among you who wants to kill his emperor, here I am." In response, a thunderous shout resonated. "Vive l'Empereur!" The soldiers joined him. He entered Paris on March 20th without firing a single shot. King Louis XVIII fled. The empire was restored. Thus began the legendary 100 Days, the final desperate attempt of Napoleon to recover France and the world. But Europe, shocked by his return, had no intention of negotiating with him. They declared him an enemy of humanity and moved their armies against him once again. The final and decisive confrontation was inevitable. It would take place in a small Belgian village called Waterloo. The 100 Days were Napoleon's final, desperate wager. He understood he had no time. The combined armies of Europe, English, Prussian, Austrian, Russian, were once again marching toward the borders of France. His only chance was to defeat them one by one before they could unite. He decided to strike the Anglo-Dutch army under the command of the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher, both stationed in Belgium. On June 18, 1815, on a field turned to mud by a torrential downpour the night before, near the small village of Waterloo, Napoleon fought his last battle. Fate seemed against him from the start. Due to the waterlogged ground, he was forced to delay the start of the attack for several hours so the artillery could move. This delay proved to be fatal. Wellington, the Iron Duke, had taken a strong defensive position on a ridge, using farms and chateaux as fortified points. A brutal and bloody carnage began. The French attacked again and again. The legendary cavalry of Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, charged wave after wave against the British squares, but without infantry support. They retreated time and again, sowing the field with the bodies of men and horses. "Give me night or give me Blücher," Wellington said anxiously. His army was crumbling before his eyes, yet it continued to resist firmly. By evening, Napoleon seemed close to victory. He launched his old guard in a final, decisive attack, the grumblers, the veterans who had never retreated. But at that moment, there appeared on the battlefield those whom Napoleon least expected, the vanguard of Blücher's Prussian army. Napoleon believed the Prussians were defeated, but the old marshal had managed to regroup his troops and rush to Wellington's aid. The strike of the fresh Prussian corps on the flank was lethal for the exhausted French army. The Guard, attacked from two sides, for the first time in its history, wavered and began to retreat. The cry, "La Garde recule!" "The Guard retreats!" spread through the French ranks, provoking general panic. The army turned into an uncontrollable mob. The battle was lost. The empire had fallen for the second and final time. Napoleon returned to Paris a broken man. He abdicated for the second time, this time forever. Attempting to flee to America, he reached the port of Rochefort, only to discover that the entire coast was blockaded by British ships. Seeing no other exit,
he made the decision he considered dignified, to surrender to his oldest and most tenacious enemies, the English, hoping for their hospitality. But England had no intention of showing magnanimity. To them, he was not a fallen monarch, but General Bonaparte, a disturber of world peace who had to be isolated from the world forever. His prison was the island of St. Helena, a tiny volcanic rock lost in the South Atlantic, thousands of kilometers from Europe, swept by all the winds. In October 1815, he arrived at the place of his final exile. Here, in the damp and uncomfortable Longwood House, under the constant surveillance of the British governor, he would spend the last 6 years of his life. It was a sharp and humiliating contrast to his past grandeur. The man who had ruled the destinies of millions now argued with his jailers over the scarcity of firewood or the quality of wine. But it was here, in this somber prison, that Napoleon began his final and perhaps most important campaign, the battle for his own legacy. He understood that his enemies would write a history in which he would be presented as a tyrant and a monster. So he decided to write his own version. Day after day, he dictated his memoirs to a small group of faithful companions who had stayed with him. In these memoirs, the Memorial of St. Helena, he created his own myth.
He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a martyr, not as a dictator, but as the heir to the revolution who brought the light of the Enlightenment to the backward monarchies of Europe. He claimed he had dreamed of creating a United States of Europe, united by common laws and currency. He justified his wars by blaming his enemies and presented his fall not only as a tragedy for himself, but for all humanity. This romantic and heroic legend would prove incredibly durable and would largely define his posthumous image. His health, undermined by humiliation and the damp climate, deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from severe stomach pains. On May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, Napoleon Bonaparte passed away. His last words, spoken in delirium, were, "France, army, vanguard." He died as he had lived, thinking of battle. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, but disputes over whether he was poisoned with arsenic continue to this day. He was buried on the island, in the Valley of the Geraniums, under a simple slab without a name. But his history did not end there. 19 years later, in 1840, the King of France, Louis Philippe, yielding to the will of the people, secured permission from England to return the emperor's remains to his homeland. His remains were repatriated with a triumph he never saw in life and reburied in Paris at Les Invalides, in a red porphyry sarcophagus where they rest to this day. So what is his legacy? It is as contradictory as the man himself. He was a despot whose wars claimed millions of lives and devastated Europe. But at the same time, his armies, sweeping across the continent, destroyed rotten feudal orders, abolished the Inquisition, and introduced his civil code everywhere, spreading ideas of equality before the law and civil rights. He was the gravedigger of the French Revolution, yet he also became its principal propagator. He demonstrated to the world that talent and will can mean more than noble lineage.
His dizzying ascent inspired entire generations of ambitious men. His tragic fall became an eternal warning of where boundless pride leads. He was neither a saint nor a demon. He was a man who, in the fitting expression of a writer, attempted to move the world and broke it. But the world he broke could never return to its former state. The era of kings had ended. The era of nations had begun.